This is a lecture video of the endocrine system. We are in chapter 16 of our textbook and looking at this particular system that's made up of a number of glands that's job is to really control homeostasis throughout the body. So we'll look at the different structures of the endocrine system and their functions. So the key word when you think of the endocrine system, the chemical signals that stimulate other cells in the body to perform a function, those chemical signals are called hormones. When we looked at the nervous system, for example, the chemical signal that stimulated cells in the body were action potentials or nerve impulses. The endocrine system is different. These are chemicals that are secreted by endocrine glands, and they travel through the bloodstream and bind to the surface or the inside receptors for that hormone. So hormones are the chemicals secreted by the endocrine system to stimulate other cells in the body. So together, the endocrine system and the nervous system are the bosses for maintaining homeostasis. So we look here at some of the glands of the endocrine system. It's kind of a small picture here, so I'm going to go to your textbook PowerPoint. It looks a little bigger. And I can make this even larger. Oops. So here we see a nice big picture of the endocrine system, of the different glands. So there are three endocrine glands that we find up here in the brain itself. So this is the little square here is blown up to show the endocrine glands in the brain. So we have the hypothalamus, which is a region just below the thalamus. And then coming off of the hypothalamus on a stalk is the pituitary gland. And there's the front part is the anterior pituitary and the back side is the posterior pituitary. So this is the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and then a small gland near the back of the diencephalon, which is part of the brain, is the pineal gland. So we're going to talk about each of these glands and their functions, but we have, again, the pituitary gland in orange, the hypothalamus shown here in green, and then the pineal gland here toward the back in light blue. So those are all endocrine glands that secrete hormones to the bloodstream, and they act on different cells throughout the body depending on what their function is. Then just below your voice box is the thyroid gland. And that is largely in control of your metabolism. You've probably heard or known people that have had either hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, but that's the thyroid gland found just in the neck region here. And then there's 4 little dots on the thyroid gland that are called the parathyroid glands. So they have a different function. They're not in charge of metabolism. We'll talk about what their function is, but these small little structures right on the thyroid are the parathyroids. Then over the surface of the heart at the top is the thymus, and in children this is quite active. It's in charge of immune cell development. So it's quite prevalent and visible in children, but as we age the thymus gland is converted to fat. So we don't see an active thymus on adults because our immune systems are already developed. So that's found over the heart, the thymus gland. Then we have the pancreas. The pancreas is found in the abdominal cavity, a little more to the left of the midline. And the pancreas has several different functions, secreting digestive enzymes and also controlling blood sugar, and we'll talk about that. And then these are the kidneys. On top of the kidneys are 2 glands called the adrenal glands, and they secrete a number of hormones, which we'll talk about, but they're located on top of the kidneys. Then we get down into the reproductive region. We have the testes in males. So the testes here in the scrotal sac are found outside the body. The testes are the male endocrine gland for reproduction. And in females, we have the ovaries. And the ovaries are here, these white structures. Those are found in the lower pelvis of the female, just inside the hip. So down low in the pelvic cavity are the ovaries. That's the female endocrine gland for reproduction. So I'm going to move out of there and go back to our PowerPoint notes. And now we've identified some of the glands. We'll just kind of talk about some terminology. So when you look at a gland, the word exocrine versus endocrine just tells us where those hormones are secreted. If a gland is secreting a hormone to the blood, it's called an endocrine gland. So endo, think of it as inside, so it's secreting a hormone inside the bloodstream into blood vessels, and it's carried throughout the body. So the only place where that hormone is going to act is on target cells that have receptors for that hormone. So they have to have the right receptor in order to bind that hormone and produce a function from that cell. Exocrine glands secrete their products into ducts. So the duct is not a vessel, it's not a blood vessel, it's just a special duct to receive that chemical, and it acts locally. So it's not in the bloodstream, it's just local production. So for example, your salivary glands are exocrine glands because they secrete saliva through the salivary duct into the mouth. That saliva doesn't go into the bloodstream, it just acts locally. We have a lacrimal gland just above our eyeball that secretes tears. It travels, the tears travel through the lacrimal duct into the eye, and it lubricates your eye. So the lacrimal gland is an example of an exocrine gland. It's not going to the blood. Another example would be the alveolar glands in the breast of a breastfeeding mother. So the breast milk travels through glands out the nipple for feeding the baby. So those are all exocrine glands, not secreting their chemicals to the bloodstream, but locally through ducts. Endocrine glands always secrete their chemicals, their hormones, to the bloodstream through the blood vessels. Okay, so looking at, again, the nervous system, the way it works is it uses neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. We talked about serotonin, dopamine. Those are neurotransmitters released from neurons that are stimulating other neurons or binding to target cells to produce a function. The endocrine system works through hormones and delivers them through the blood. And because it has to deliver through the blood, it's not acting directly on a target cell right near it. It takes a little longer. So to get the effects of the endocrine system hormone, it takes a little time for that to be distributed through the blood and to bind to the target cells. And because of that also, it takes a little longer for those hormones to be broken down and metabolized by the body. So the effects of endocrine function are a little slower, but they last longer, all because of those hormones are widespread through the bloodstream versus a neurotransmitter that acts directly on a target cell and stimulates it right away and is broken down right away. So endocrine system takes longer to kick in and lasts longer once it's being distributed throughout the body, those hormones. So both of them use negative feedback system, which means if I have a lot of hormone in the bloodstream, that's going to inhibit that endocrine gland from secreting more hormone. And also it's going to correct, an issue in the body. For example, if there's high blood sugar, then the endocrine system, the pancreas, is going to secrete insulin, which is going to bind to body cells to take up that excess blood sugar, and then blood sugar goes down. So that's an example of a negative feedback system, as the body is responding to reverse or correct some increase or decrease in a body function or a chemical, in this case, blood sugar. So here is kind of an example of how a neurotransmitter works. Remember, we have neurotransmitters that are released from vesicles in axon terminal, and it enters into the synaptic cleft, binds to a cell receptor here for acetylcholine, and in this case, let's say it's acetylcholine, and then sodium enters in and that cell is stimulated. So that is an example of how the nervous system works. But the way the endocrine system works is we are secreting a hormone to the blood. For example, we're talking about, insulin. So insulin is secreted through the bloodstream throughout the body, and then it enters into the interstitial fluid between the cells and the bloodstream, and then it binds and stimulates that liver cell to do whatever it's going to do, which might be to break down glycogen, release glucose to the blood, or whatever the function that we need from that liver cell. So again, the pancreas is releasing the insulin to the bloodstream. It travels through the bloodstream to the liver and binds to cells on the liver. So it takes time. Where this is more direct, we have an axon terminal acting directly here on an arterial and stimulating, maybe this is smooth muscle, maybe it's stimulating this arterial to constrict. Just depends on what the function is. So just a little difference between those two systems. So hormones are chemical signals, which means they stimulate other cells, and they often, again, act at a distance from where they're secreted. So the pancreas secretes insulin, and that insulin travels everywhere throughout the body. And they can affect metabolism as long as those cells have receptors to bind that. So for example, the thyroid hormones, when they travel through the bloodstream and bind on cells, they can either increase the function of those cells or decrease the function of those cells. So it's all about the receptors on these target cells. In order for a hormone to bind to a cell, it has to have the receptor that is specific to that hormone. So here we can see these two target cells have these orange receptors that will bind these light green or tan hormones because they are compatible. But this cell here, for example, doesn't have the right receptor. It has a different shape. It's not going to bind that hormone because those two are not compatible. So we know that some cells are specific for a hormone while others, are unaffected by a particular hormone. It's all about the receptors. So the hypothalamus is really boss of the endocrine system. It controls the secretion of other endocrine glands throughout the body. So when we look at, for example, the nervous system, we saw the hypothalamus was really in charge of the autonomic nervous system as well. But when we talk about the endocrine system, it's really in control of the major gland of the nervous system, which is the Pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It's not a gland per se, but it is very much in control of the other glands of the body, and it's majorly controlling the Pituitary gland. We'll talk about that. So the hypothalamus and the Pituitary gland are connected by a stalk, which neurons travel through one portion, blood vessels travel through another portion of the pituitary. We'll look at that in our next picture. So if I go back to my PowerPoint here and I look at the relationship between the two hormones, or two parts of the pituitary gland. So here's the hypothalamus. There's neurons that travel down through this stalk to the pituitary gland. So these are the two lobes of the pituitary gland, and this is the posterior, this is the anterior. So you always have to know what direction this brain is facing. So this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain, there's the cerebellum. So there's neurons that travel from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary and release those, and the axon terminals of these neurons release ADH and oxytocin to the bloodstream to be distributed throughout the body. So the posterior pituitary gland is actually made up of neurons. It's not made up of endocrine cells. It's actual neurons. So the posterior pituitary gland is very different from the anterior pituitary, which is made up of endocrine cells. So the neurons of ADH and oxytocin are produced in the cell body of these neurons. It travels down the axon, stored in the axon terminals, and then released to the bloodstream. So the posterior pituitary is just basically a slave to the hypothalamus, just storing those hormones, ADH and oxytocin. Now if we look at the other part of the pituitary, the anterior pituitary gland, this is stimulated by the hypothalamus has neurons that it releases to a special capillary bed that goes directly to the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary is made up of cells that are stimulated by hormones released by the hypothalamus, but it enters that through a small capillary network between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. So these cells are typical endocrine cells, and they secrete a number of hormones, and we'll talk about those hormones in a little bit. The posterior pituitary only releases two hormones. It's ADH, standing for antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So each of these hormones have different functions. Oxytocin causes contractions of the uterus and milk letdown in the breast. And ADH causes the reabsorption of water by the kidneys to keep us from urinating out our plasma. So ADH is an important hormone for controlling blood pressure and water balance in the body. So if we look at the anterior pituitary, it produces a number of hormones. So the way it secretes its hormones is the hypothalamus stimulates or sends an electrical signal which stimulates hormones that will act on the anterior pituitary, telling them to release their hormone. So the anterior pituitary requires stimulation from the hypothalamus to secrete their hormone. So that's why the hypothalamus is really boss of the endocrine system, because it controls the pituitary gland secretions. So there's a number of hormones released by the pituitary gland. We have TSH that stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete its hormones. So the anterior pituitary releases TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. That hormone, when released by the pituitary gland, acts on the adrenal glands and tells them to secrete their hormones. Then prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone that acts on the glands of the breast during breastfeeding and stimulates them to produce milk in the breast. Growth hormone acts on bone and muscle and connective tissue and promotes growth of the body, and also plays a role in metabolism. And then we have FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary that act on the ovaries and the testes. So this is the ovary, this is the testes. So the hormones from the anterior pituitary gland are TSH, ACTH, PRL, which stands for prolactin, GH, which stands for growth hormone, FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. All of these hormones are secreted by the anterior pituitary, but only after the hypothalamus tells them to release those hormones by sampling the blood and measuring the levels that are already in the blood. So that's what the job of the hypothalamus is to sample the blood, make sure that there is a need for these hormones before it stimulates the anterior pituitary to go ahead and produce and release those hormones. So these are the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. Remember, the posterior pituitary gland only secretes ADH and oxytocin. That's this portion of the pituitary. The anterior pituitary gland makes a lot more, which are these listed here. So the hypothalamus, like I said, is kind of boss of the hormone. When it comes time to release a hormone, for example, if we're looking at thyroid hormone, if the levels of thyroid or thyroxine are low in the blood, the hypothalamus will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release. In this case, they kind of reverse the lobes of the anterior pituitary, so the anterior is on this side now. But if we have low levels of thyroxine in the body, then what will happen is the hypothalamus will release its hormone called TRH to the anterior pituitary, and that'll stimulate the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which enters the bloodstream and binds to cells on the thyroid gland, and then the thyroid gland will secrete thyroxine to the bloodstream. So it's kind of a multi-step process. The hypothalamus has to secrete some hormones to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases hormones to the blood, which binds to the thyroid gland, and then the thyroid gland secretes thyroxine. So these glands don't operate independently. Some of them do, but not all of them do. Some of them require a hormone from the anterior pituitary to tell them to produce their hormones and release them to the blood. So it's really a very controlled process for hormone secretion. So you can see if there's a problem with the anterior pituitary, that can affect the other endocrine glands because they're either going to be overstimulated or understimulated to release their hormones. So we often look, when we see hormone imbalances in patients, we not only look at the endocrine gland for that specific hormone, but we also look at the pituitary gland to see if it's working properly, because it releases many hormones that control these endocrine glands. So here's an example of underproduction of growth hormone during childhood, and this is overproduction of growth hormone in childhood. So we can see what a difference that makes, how it either does not produce growth, and we have overgrowth before puberty. Another example is when we look at thyroid hormone. If we have excess production of thyroid hormone or TSH from the pituitary gland, we're going to end up with a goiter, which is an enlargement of the thyroid gland. And that can also cause swelling of the eyes because of increased blood sugar resulting from a increased thyroid. We can end up with excess blood sugar production or in the bloodstream, and that causes swelling of the eyes. It's called exophthalmos, but that's just an extra swelling of the eye that we see with people with hyperthyroidism. Going back then to to our our notes. So we're going to go through each of the hormones real quickly, just talking about, the posterior pituitary. We said ADH and oxytocin, where are the hormones produced by the posterior pituitary, and they are stored there, but actually produced by the hypothalamus, by those neurons, and they're stored in the posterior pituitary. And when we look at that, we just saw that picture already. Remember, they're produced here, stored in the axon terminals, and then released to the blood when necessary. So the ADH is for water-salt balance. Its job is to reabsorb water in the kidneys. So if we need to conserve water, let's say a person has a bout of vomiting and diarrhea, we want to conserve water and not urinate much if a person is losing it through the digestive tract during a flu bug. So then they're going to increase, the hypothalamus will increase stimulation to the posterior pituitary to release that ADH into the blood and conserve water. If we don't have any ADH production due to damage to the posterior pituitary, that's going to cause us to lose water, because if the job of the ADH is to conserve water, if we're not producing ADH, we're going to lose water, and there's going to be lots and lots of dilute urine that is produced, and that can cause a drop in blood pressure and cause us to have, sodium and potassium loss, and can be very serious. So it's something that definitely needs to be corrected. Oxytocin causes uterine contractions during childbirth and milk letdown during breastfeeding. So that is an important thing for childbirth and feeding baby. And it also plays a role in female orgasm. It's released during female orgasm, again causing those contractions and helping pull sperm up toward the ovaries for reproduction. So oxytocin is released by positive feedback, which means that release of that hormone doesn't inhibit further release, it actually encourages more release. So when oxytocin is released to the bloodstream during childbirth, it causes more oxytocin release from the posterior pituitary. That's not typical in the body. Mostly hormones and glands operate by negative feedback, which means once we have enough of the hormone in the bloodstream, that inhibits further production and release. But in the case of oxytocin, it encourages more release, because we want that. We want those contractions to increase and continue to increase in order to birth that infant. So that's why oxytocin has positive feedback, because the goal is to increase contractions until the child is born. We'll continue in the next video talking about the hormones of the anterior pituitary.